this video, we're going to be talking about engaging people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Intellectual and developmental disabilities, we can refer to it as IDD. They are disorders that are typically found to be existent at birth and generally influence several body parts or systems. It is likely for intellectual and developmental conditions to have negative impacts on a person's intellectual, emotional, and physical growth. IDD is kind of a general term for both intellectual and developmental disabilities being present. Intellectual disabilities refer more to the intellectual limitations such as reasoning, learning, and problem solving. This can range from being mild to severe. And then the term developmental disabilities, that tends to be more severe chronic or lifelong disabilities. And these conditions can be cognitive, physical, or both. Some disorders include autism spectrum disorder, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, Angelman syndrome, fetal alcohol syndrome, and then there's other neurological impairments that can be named as well. For a long time, the term intellectual disabilities used to be referred to as mental retardation. However, it is best to completely refrain from using that term at all, as it is linked to more of a negative connotation. And then this goes hand in hand with using people first language. It's just always best to put the person before the disability. And I talk more about that in the mobility impairments training section. If you get the chance to study the history of people with disabilities, I would highly recommend it. You will be shocked and your heart will just melt and soften to the persecution, the misery, and torment that people with disabilities have gone through, and some are still going through. Most families feel the shame of having a child with a disability. So back in the day, they even would hide them in their homes because they had fear that the public would know that they had a child with a disability and they would be shamed. And so those children were stuck in their homes. They never got to see the outside world or even engage with people in their culture. I mean, how lonely. I think many people with intellectual and developmental disabilities can testify to feeling lonely their entire lives. And their lives might look different than ours, and so that's why it's important to learn about what it looks like for them, and then we can get to know them and help them shape their lives for the better. I am a skill building specialist for adults with autism at Focus Behavioral Health, and many of the participants that I've encountered do not live the same social life that you or I might have. Once they're out of the school system, where they're taken care of pretty well, our world's done a really good job at, or America has done a really good job of creating a good school system for people with disabilities. But once they get out of that system, they're really on their own. Some families get them services that they need to continue to grow, or maybe they'll get them an apartment to live in on their own, help them get a job, put them into a group home, which can be a good thing or a bad thing, or sometimes they just sit at home all day long. Granted, not all cases are like this. I've seen and worked with parents that do a phenomenal job at providing their children with the help that they need after high school, but that's not every case. There are some that end up homeless because they cannot pay their rent, or maybe there's another reason. Then people passing by on the streets, they just assume that these people are drunk or drugged and just completely disregard them. And there's even been some unfortunate events with police officers arresting them because they're assuming they're on drugs or they're drunk, and so sometimes people with just disabilities end up in jail for the wrong reason. And so we can start by looking back at scriptures reference to people that did have disabilities. We'll just jump to the New Testament. So while Jesus was on earth, the Jewish leaders were still performing sacrifices and offerings to God. The Jewish leaders did not recognize Jesus as the Messiah, and so they still don't today. And so therefore, the people with disabilities were still thought to be unclean. In John 9, the story the story where Jesus heals a man that was blind by the pool of Siloam, the disciples asked Jesus if someone had sinned to cause the blindness. And Jesus says that it was not that anyone sinned to cause the man to be blind, but it was that the works of God would be displayed. So then Jesus spits on the ground and mixes his saliva with dirt and anoints the man's eyes and tells him to go and wash in the pool. And the man washes and he can see. And so one of the things I like most about this passage is that Jesus approached a man that society considered to be an invalid and or an unclean man, and he used dirt, which is not clean by any means, to wash and cleanse and purify this man's eyesight. And it says that the man knew that Jesus was sent by God. So then the passage goes on to say that the neighbors were confused because they knew this man to be blind and to be a beggar. So they brought the man to the Pharisees, and the Pharisees questioned him. First, they didn't like that he said that Jesus healed him on the Sabbath. And secondly, after the man continues to testify that Jesus was from God, the Pharisees actually cut him off, and they say, well, you were born in utter sin and you're trying to teach us. And they cast him out of the temple. And this is exactly how the passage started. The disciples were asking about what sin caused the man to be born blind. And then at the end of the passage, the Pharisees say the same thing. And the Pharisees, they just completely disregard the man because they believed that he was born in sin. So whatever he said just wasn't worth listening to. So as opposed to Jesus, who saw past the man's visible defect, he approached him. He declared that no one brought sin on the man, but that it was the works of God would be displayed, and he heals the man. And so the compassion that Jesus shows in this passage is tremendous, and that's what we get to show to others now. So jumping a little bit further into history, and up until the 90s, people with IDD were put into institutions in America and other countries as well, completely separated from the rest of society. Leaders and parents did not know what to do with children with special needs that were acting in ways that they didn't know how to deal with. And so they began to institutionalize them. And eventually these people were seen as inhumane. They were not seen as typical people because they were different. And in the institutions, there was a large amount of abuse. And the pictures and stories are just awful. I'm shocked by how long it took America to get to the point of shutting them down. There are even some institutions that have yet to be shut down. And then also today, in America and other countries, we are still working to deconstruct people's mindsets on people with IDD. I know that India still uses the caste system. So people with disabilities are the untouchables. They're at the bottom of the pyramid. Their culture excludes them from being seen as a member of society. And so I was actually talking to a friend of mine who had spent a long time working as a missionary in India, and she said that she hardly even saw people with disabilities while she was there. They are more hidden, and it can be tough to find them in different cultures because they're not valued. So you won't be seeing them in the everyday lives of the other civilians. So to begin, you have to know where to find people with disabilities. Amber Lee calls this the pools of Bethesda in the work that the Banquet Network does. We encourage churches to use things like their phone or computers or other devices to look up places that could hold people with or house people with disabilities there. And then we encourage churches to go there and befriend them and invite them to church and find out how their church can support them or welcome them or any way possible. And so when engaging with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, another place to start is also our mindsets and to see them as persons made in the image of God. They're people, and you don't have more value than them. They're human. They're just as human as you are. And this is really important to note because oftentimes we have the tendency to put ourselves above them. We see ourselves as more valuable than them because maybe we have more to offer, which is awful. They are also made in the image of God and are able to offer themselves to society in different ways than us, in ways that we can't. Even someone that is bedridden. We can think back on John 9, where Jesus says that the man that was blind, he was blind to display the works of God. And so it's just really good to check our hearts when we're around people with disabilities and not to consider them as the least of these and putting ourselves above them, because when scripture refers to the least of these, he's talking about all of us that are broken and full of sin. So we have no more value than them. So that's just important to remember. And then when we talk with people with disabilities, we should talk to them in the same way that we talk to anyone else. This especially goes for adults with disabilities. Sometimes we find ourselves talking as if we're talking to a child, when really we're speaking to an adult. And then even if the adult's brain seems to be functioning like a toddler or a 10-year-old, or even if they're talking like a 10-year-old, it's just best to treat them like their age. Also, just because a person has a disability, that does not always mean that they are unhealthy. Sometimes their bodies are more prone to getting other health conditions, but that does not mean that they're unhealthy. And also that doesn't even go for all people that have disabilities. Sometimes people with disabilities will have trouble communicating with people. You may find that they also find it difficult to talk or to understand what other people are saying, or to read or to write. It is good to speak at a pace that allows a person with a disability to consider your question and think about their response. I find it best to ask one question at a time and then give the person time to say what they want to say, and listen carefully to them. If you don't understand what they're saying, don't pretend to understand, because people can pick up on that, and also it's just not respectful. It would be better to ask a question to clarify that you heard them correctly, or if needed, you can ask them to repeat themselves. If you're still not understanding, I would continue to ask clarifying questions, because this also lets them know that you want to understand them, and that speaks loudly. And then if they are not understanding what you're saying, try taking an alternative approach. You can try to explain it differently, or maybe try and use close-ended questions with yes or no instead of open-ended questions. Or you can try to use a picture as a visual aid. There's lots of ways to get around trying to understand someone. Sometimes people with disabilities have a hard time understanding social cues. This is a large thing, I think, because a lot of times people write them off because they're coming off as immature or they're being a little awkward. And this is because of their learning disability. For instance, let's say you're hanging out with Mark, and Mark walks into a library, and you're with Mark, and Mark goes straight for the librarian at the front desk, and he says, "Dak Prescott didn't know he was walking into his own funeral." And I know that Mark loves the Eagles, and the Eagles just beat the Cowboys the night before, and Mark is really excited about it, but the librarian is just kind of looking at Mark strangely. So I would say, "Hey Mark, I don't think she understands what you're referring to. Can you explain that to her?" And then Mark can go on to say that the Eagles beat the Cowboys. But now let's just add a little bit more onto this situation. Let's say that Mark gets fixated on the game that occurred because he's just so excited about the win, and he goes into every little detail about the game. So Mark just keeps on talking, and this gives no room for this person to talk back at Mark, to even say anything, to get a word in. And so this is called perseverating. It's when someone gets fixated on something and either just continues on repeating it or talking about it, and mentally they cannot switch gears. So at this point, I would redirect Mark, and I would say something like, "Hey Mark, didn't you want to go and look at some of the books on sports? Maybe you can ask her where the sports section is." Sometimes redirecting will help, and sometimes they just cannot switch their gears. If Mark is unwilling to give it up, then you can kindly interrupt him, and you can say something along the lines of, "Hey, I think you've shared enough with this person. Why Why don't you let her get some work done now and we can go and find a book. Again, that's a little bit of redirecting, but letting them know, just being a little bit upfront with them and saying like, hey, you've shared a lot and I think she has some things to get done. That is letting them know that, okay, it's time to be done now. We want to teach them what is appropriate and what is not. So another situation could be something like you and Mark are walking to a food market and Mark darts straight for the 15-year-old girl by the apple stand. And let's say that Mark is 50 years old. Mark asks the girl, hey, do you live around here? And you notice that Mark is standing very close to her. And then he proceeds to say, I think you're really pretty. And he shares where he lives and he starts talking about when they are gonna hang out together. So from the start, Mark is coming off as a creepy guy to this young girl. And first, the age difference is inappropriate. Mark doesn't realize that he's a lot older than this girl. And so this actually happens pretty often. But in Mark's mind, there's no age difference. He doesn't see her as much younger than him, and therefore he doesn't recognize that he's coming off as a creepy guy. Secondly, Mark asks her where she lives. He doesn't realize that that's not a question that you don't ask strangers. Thirdly, Mark is standing really close to her, which is another frequent occurrence for people with disability. They're not very good at judging personal space, so they oftentimes will invade that with a lot of people. And then if they're doing that, you can just say, hey, do you mind taking a step back? Or, hey, you're standing pretty close to me. Do you mind just taking a step back? I'm just feeling a little bit uncomfortable. Again, just being upfront is best. The fourth thing is that Mark is telling her that he finds her attractive, which again is not appropriate given her age. Fifthly, he shares where he lives, which is also just something he should keep to himself, right? And not share with strangers. And then he proceeds to talk about what they're going to do together when they hang out. So all of these things scream creepy, right? And so Mark doesn't notice any of it. I would kindly ask if I could talk to Mark in private and interrupt that conversation. And then I would respectfully share why his actions are kind of coming off as inappropriate. And some will be receptive, and then there's others that won't. It really just depends on the person. And then another thing to consider for people with disabilities is that due to their disability, they sometimes have trouble articulating or understanding their own emotions. Emotions, just like anyone, they will feel angry, they will feel frustrated, annoyed, guilty, depressed, happy, and excited. And we can help them cope in positive ways. For instance, let's say you're at a breakfast cafe with Mark. Mark gets his food and they give him regular bacon instead of turkey bacon. And Mark gets up, flips the table, and runs out of the cafe. He storms out. I have actually seen this situation happen. So sometimes it's hard to prevent situations like this from happening. What you can do is talk to Mark about it after he's calmed down, and probably at a later time. And you can just say, hey, like, what happened this morning? And you can listen to their response, and then you can go on to talk about why his response was inappropriate. You could say, people were sitting near us and your orange juice went on the woman behind us, and you could have hurt someone with the table or the plates, and talk about maybe what he can do next time something like that happens. And then you can also just help them do the right thing by encouraging him to go back to the cafe and to apologize. Right, so we can teach these people good people skills. Then also next time, so now you know that Mark is particular about his food. So before going into the cafe or a breakfast spot, you can have a conversation with him and just say, hey, I know that you love your turkey bacon. Sometimes people mess up orders, and if they give you regular bacon instead of turkey, you can calmly say to the waiter, sir, I ordered turkey bacon. Can I get turkey bacon instead of this kind? And so again, we can just help them and teach them positive ways to cope and respond. If you do see negative behaviors like flipping tables occur, some ways that you can help a person calm down is to go for a walk. You can take them to get a drink of water. You can help them find a quiet place for them to calm down. And if they haven't left this space that they had a behavior episode in, then help them remove themselves from that space, and then at a later time they can re-enter. One thing I've noticed in my work with people with disabilities is also their lack of community. It is pretty common for people with disabilities to stay in the same general area that they have been born, and even still, they are not familiar with their own community. What I try to do is to introduce them to the people that we see during the day. So if I know that Mark loves going to the mall and buying pretzels at the Annie Ann's stand, I would help Mark introduce himself to the woman that sells the Annie Ann's. Then each time that we would go to the mall to buy pretzels, he can talk to this woman. So we can build a little bit of friendship and community at the places that he is familiar with. So this is just an easy way to help that person build community, because like all people, they need community, and they need fellowship too. And that's another reason why I'm just so passionate about the church, getting involved and being the community and the support for people with disabilities. It's just what the church is called to be. So I've also worked closely with a nonverbal friend. Engaging with people that are nonverbal can be pretty difficult. And I will say that the more that you spend time with them, the more that you get to know them. And then you can also get to know them to the point where you don't even have to use words. And so let's just call my friend Mark. Mark could understand what I say, but he could only respond with a few words. So most times I would ask Mark, where do you want to go? And he would repeat, go. And I would say, do you want to go to the supermarket? And he would say, market, yeah. And I quickly learned that Mark repeats things that I say, and he will say yes to pretty much anything, even if he doesn't like it. And so the more time that I spent with Mark, I learned that Mark actually hates going to the supermarket. He begins to burst into stimming, which can be things like repetitive motions, such as drumming their fingers, moaning loudly, flopping their hands. Sometimes they will hit themselves. Sometimes they'll just fidget with objects, plug their ears and close their eyes. Sometimes they'll just move their head back and forth, or they'll rock back and forth. Sometimes they'll repeat a sentence that they have heard someone say before, but that sentence doesn't even make sense given the situation. So those are just a few examples of stimming. Some can be negative and some can be positive stimming. This can take time to understand per person, but it is really helpful once you do know them. And then when you get to know things like their likes and dislikes, you can actually use that in conversation. You can also use pictures and visual aids when you're working with people that are nonverbal. You can pull up pictures on your phone to help them understand what you're trying to say. Let them use your phone. So for me, like when I was with Mark, like it took him 6 months to tell me what he ate for dinner the night before. And so it took a lot of patience to get to that point, but it was so rewarding once I finally heard what Mark did the night before. Sign language is another really good way to communicate with those that understand sign. You can learn the alphabet and sign out your letters to them, or you can memorize just a few things that to have conversations with them. And right there, that's just the love of Jesus. That tells the person that they're known and that they're loved and that they're celebrated. And that's because you're getting to know their own language. You're getting to know them. And so that is loving them in the way that Christ would. And so one of my favorite ways to interact with people that are nonverbal is to sing songs with them. Mark loved to hum. And one time I heard him humming Jesus Loves Me. And so every time I was with Mark, we would sing Jesus Loves Me together. And Mark even started singing the words because he was repeating what he had heard me say, which is amazing, right? And so every time I was with Mark, we would sing hundreds of songs together throughout the day. And it was awesome. And it was a beautiful friendship. It really was, and still is. And so this is just a really cool way to share the gospel with someone that may not know sign or seem like they don't fully or can completely understand or comprehend things really well. Songs are a great way to interact. I think that learning to engage with people with disabilities or those that are nonverbal is definitely one of the most rewarding things. It's like learning Spanish to connect with someone that speaks Spanish, except with people that are nonverbal, you're learning their own language. This is not something that you can find in a textbook. It's just different for each person. And so it just brings about a really beautiful friendship. And I know I've shared a lot of content in this video, but I do want to say that you don't need to know any of these nitty-gritty terms, the physiological things or their diagnosis to be able to engage with them. You don't need to know if someone has autism or if it's something else. You can love them without knowing those things. They're an image bearer too, and so you can love them knowing that. And Jesus also looks past those things, and so I would encourage you guys to also see past those things as well, and that's really when we can see them as people. So I hope all of this was helpful for you guys when you encounter people with disabilities. And bottom line, if you love them with the love of Christ, that's just the best thing that you can do. So good luck with your future endeavors, and I pray that the Lord would fill you while you go out and give his love to his people.